Hi, thanks for joining us for the Toro Law Review podcast. I'm Professor Michelle Zakarin, and today I have Professor Hal Abramson here. He has a very interesting and extensive background, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things he's done in his legal career. And I think many people who watch this and listen to this may find it inspiring and interesting to hear about some different types of options, that there's so much out there, so much available with a law degree, so many things you can do. And Hal's done many of these things. So I'm looking forward to asking him some interesting questions and starting our conversation. But for now, I'd love to just introduce him to all of you. For anyone who doesn't know him, Professor Abramson is a full-time faculty member at Toro Law Center in New York, where he has taught, trained, arbitrated, mediated, and published articles and books on negotiations, mediation advocacy, and intercultural and international disputes for more than 30 years. Professor Abramson has engaged in a wide range of dispute resolution initiatives since early in his career. He is an experienced domestic and international commercial mediator. He has been selected for the International Who's Who of Commercial Mediation since its inaugural year. He has mediated a range of cases, including international ones with translators. He also serves on the AALS's 20-person panel that facilitates strategic planning processes at law schools. At Toro, Professor Abramson served for 9 years as Vice Dean, responsible for academic programs, faculty development, and international programs, and was one of the first 2 faculty members inducted in the Law Center's Builders Society. He has taught online courses and a range of business-related courses, including contract sales, remedies, international business transactions, business organizations, and antitrust. And that's just some of it, a bit of it. I really just touched the surface, but that's a good introduction for you to hear just a little bit about him. And so welcome, Professor Abramson. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
You're very welcome. It's exciting to have you here. So I guess I just want to start by, and please fill in anything you feel that, you'd like the viewers to know. But I wanted to start by just asking you a little bit about your background from really way back, when you first started, about working with environmental issues. So tell us a little bit about your experience with environmental law and whether you ever considered pursuing this field as an attorney, as part of your career, or as a law professor, if you ever considered that. So please.
Sure. Well, you said way back then, that was when I did not have any gray hair. So that was a long time ago. And it really goes back to college for me, when I was at the University of Michigan undergraduate, and this will date me quite a bit. There was something going on that people were thinking about having on environmental issues, something called a teach-in, and something people are making up called Earth Day. And we're talking about the very first Earth Day. And this is 1970. And I went to this teach-in at the University of Michigan. There were hundreds of events being held, and the big event that I went to was very inspiring to me. And it was, we're talking about climate change now and all the problems with what's happening in this world due to climate change that we're seeing throughout the world is, it seems a little unsettling that it was 50 years ago when we first started thinking about these issues and where we are today. But this is way back then when people were just thinking, we got a problem here with the environment, and we need to be thinking about air pollution, water pollution, what's happening to us in our cities and our communities. And I went and was very inspired by all this. So I went to the teach-in, heard some fabulous speakers, and then thought, hey, I should get involved in this. And the following year, I became head of that organization that hosted the teach-in. And so now I'm in the middle of it all with what was happening in year 2 for the second Earth Day. And then I decided, I'm going to go off to law school, or should I go into graduate school and maybe get a PhD in the sciences because that's what you need to do and know in order to go in the environmental field. And then I realized I wasn't interested. That wasn't my background. Science wasn't my strength. And I realized that that probably is a bit of a mistake. And when I wanted to do something in public interest law, which is a thread throughout my entire career, I thought it was going to be in the environmental field. But instead, I moved into consumer protection. And I go off to law school, and I arrived at law school, and I started talking about setting up an environmental law society, and I got funding from the Student Bar Association, and then decided this wasn't a good fit for me. Instead, I saw there was a new group being advertised that they're trying to form, something called the Public Interest Research Group. It was a Nader-based organization they're trying to create at different universities around the country. And they were trying to set one up in central New York. And I decided, I'll go to the organizational meeting. So I go to the meeting. Next thing I know, I'm on their board. Next thing I know, I'm spending my first year in law school, learning how to draft corporation papers to set up this organization. And now PIRG is, it's an established organization with campuses all throughout the country, all throughout New York, I should say. But New York PIRG started in my backyard, so to speak. And then I went on to do other stuff after that. But that's how it all got started. But I had to make a shift because it wasn't the right fit. I had a business background. I had a business degree. That wasn't going to work in environmental law. So I moved on to other areas.
That's good. So sometimes you have an interest in one thing, especially business. Let's say you had an interest in business. You didn't even know you would have an interest in the environment until you were inspired by the group that you saw. So I think that's
that's not quite the way it played out. I really wasn't that interested in business at the time. I was taking the business degree because that's what my parents encouraged me to do. And I didn't know what I wanted to do in my life. So I got the business degree, not sure if that's what I wanted to do. And so when I got to the University of Michigan, when I saw these other things, and by the way, the Earth Day was being hosted by the School of Natural Resources. So next thing I know, I'm spending time in the School of Natural Resources. Then I got involved in the psychology department, and I taught a course in the psychology department as a TA. So I started sort of spreading my wings a little bit. And that's when I discovered that my interest was elsewhere. And that's why I started moving toward consumer protection, because consumer protection combines a business background with something I was interested in, and that was more public interest law.
Yeah, it sounds like you really did find the perfect fit for you, for yourself. And
well, that's the challenge.
Exactly. That's the challenge. I think we've both seen students here at Toro and probably elsewhere as well, but we've seen students who come in, they never knew if they even wanted law school, but they're here and now maybe they'll be a lawyer. Maybe they won't use the degree. We see people who are in law school, but really not sure what area of law they want to practice in. And many of them, and we encourage them, get an internship in this field, in that field, try it all. Like, now is the time, see what you're interested in. Maybe something will stick, take classes, take electives, see if anything really sparks your interest. And I think that it's okay to not know what you want to do from day one and really be open-minded, right? And so that's very telling. Exactly. No, that's right. But moving along, I wanted to also talk to you a little bit about your work when you filed amicus briefs. So how did you get involved with writing them when you were working with a state agency?
Well, what happened is that after I started my career, my first full-time job working as a poverty lawyer for a legal services organization upstate New York, and I did that for a couple of years, and then the New York State Consumer Protection Agency, a state agency, tried to entice me to come there. I was enjoying practicing law, but there were some amazing opportunities that they were offering there. So I go there, and what happened was that some people heard there was a poverty lawyer located at the state agency, and they had some cases going up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So I got these calls, one in particular from an attorney who said, we have a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. Would you be interested in filing an amicus brief? And I said, and meanwhile, you have to remember, I'm 3 years out of law school. I was not, in those days, you had to be 5 years out of law school in order to be a member of the Supreme Court bar. I don't know what the rule is today. Maybe still 5 years. So I wasn't even out long enough to be a member of the Supreme Court bar. In fact, I think I filed all my briefs before I was officially a member of the Supreme Court bar because I filed 3 briefs in 3 different cases. So in this first case, I get this call from someone by the name of Marty Schwartz, who I did not know. And he was an attorney in Westchester and said he has this case. Are we interested in filing an amicus brief? Now, as you may recall, Marty Schwartz, our paths recrossed years later when we both ended up teaching at Toro, where we taught for decades, actually. What small world. So I meet him for the first time with this inquiry, and we ended up filing an amicus brief to support his case. The interesting issue raised, which is why he strategically probably thought it was a good idea to try to get us to file an amicus brief, is that we started discovering when we filed these briefs, and there's, like I said, several cases, that it was creating some confusion within New York State, because who's speaking on behalf of the state of New York? So one of the state agencies in one of the cases, it was not his case, but another case, contested our application to file an amicus brief under the argument that we should only have one voice to speak on behalf of the state of New York. And we said, well, we bring a different voice than you bring. And we filed that brief, made the arguments before the Supreme Court, and they granted our request to file the amicus brief, although they are liberal in that department. But they did it, but we had a contested motion, which is quite rare when it comes to amicus applications.
And it was creative thinking on your part, your group's part, because you were able to get it filed, and that's wonderful. That's good.
Well, we brought a different voice. Our legislation, we were representing consumers, and the other representative of the state was representing the entire state. So that was the argument we made. So
and it worked, and
it worked. It prevailed. It prevailed. And so I got this experience doing these amicus briefs, which was fun.
I really
also in those days, it was different than today. You had to file hard copy, so you had to I remember one of the briefs I was up all night. In the morning, I had to take the governor's plane to Albany, from Albany to New York City to get the brief to the printer in time to get it filed to the Supreme Court. Now everything's done with a click.
Very different, but no, that is the way it was done, and there was no. You couldn't be late. You couldn't. There was
you couldn't
no.
Be late. Can't be late. And you had to leave time to get printed.
And I do love the connection with Marty Schwartz. For anyone who isn't sure who we're talking about, he was also a professor here at Toro. He has retired a couple of years ago, but he was also a professor here at Toro. So your paths crossed for a while you were both working here. Yeah, very small world. That's great. That's a great story. My next question has to do with your work with the White House in the late 70s. So you were there, you were working there when there was this energy crisis. And any stories to share about that? We'd love to hear.
Well, I have to remind you that all these stories so far, I'm under 30 years old.
Wow, yeah, that is a good point.
So I'm still pretty young, and these things are coming fast. And life is a combination of working hard and being lucky. So I think I was lucky with these opportunities, but I don't know if I was lucky given what was going on historically, because what was going on is we had the first oil embargo, and oil prices started skyrocketing, and oil prices were impacting on energy costs. And remember, I'm involved in energy issues, working for a state consumer protection agency, focusing in part on energy issues. And at this point in time, I'm now head of that office. It's an office in charge of representing utility consumers and energy issues. And I had a staff of economists and engineers and computer programmers. And our job was to represent consumers in these utility rate applications. So energy costs were skyrocketing, and it was all front page news at that time. And so one day I'm sitting in my office, and I get a call. My assistant comes running into my office, and Joan was her name. Joan says, "You got someone from the White House on the phone." And I'm thinking, that's a joke, right? Ha, 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 Joan. Okay, go back to work. No, you really got someone says they're from the White House. I said, okay, so someone's calling with a joke. So I get on the phone, and we all see about this in the movies. You see about this, and you read about it in the paper. You get that call from the White House. I'm 29 years old. And I get on the phone, the person says, "Hi, I'm from the White House. I'm from this." And Esther Peterson, who's a presidential advisor on consumer affairs. We'd like you to come and speak at a White House conference on a new order that President Carter had just signed on requiring federal agencies to implement a new consumer protection requirement. And next thing I know, I'm flying off to Washington to present to this conference. So you never know.
Right. You really never know. You really never know. And that
Yeah.
it's uncommon. And it is, I know you say a little bit of luck. I think also it has to do with you were the right person for that opportunity. So it worked out well. That's perfect.
Well, it did work out well. I never know why these things happen, but I wasn't going to ask.
I don't think I blame you.
Although the moment was a little bit challenging. Remember, again, I'm 29, 30 years old, and I'm having lunch before the presentation with this presidential advisor to the president, this advisor to the president, Esther Peterson was her name. And she says, okay, we're going to now go into the next room where the conference is, and you'll get to present along with two other speakers, only three speakers, two other speakers, and talk about how federal agencies can comply with this new executive order. I said, fine. So I walk out into the auditorium, and there are like 400 or 500 people there. It's like packed, and these are all federal agency people. And then she introduces me, and she says to me, I have my good friend, I think she could not even remember my name, my good friend from the state of New York, who's here to explain to the U.S. Department of Energy all the things they're doing wrong. I go, no, that's not the kind of introduction I was looking for. This is an agency that I was working with, I was getting money from. I wasn't about to come to them and say, you got it all wrong. Besides, no one wants to hear that anyhow. So then I explained what I liked about what they were doing and where I think they could improve it. And thus became my presentation.
Very diplomatic answer, right? Very diplomatic answer. That's great. And that's so funny. That's wonderful. Since then, you're known for a lot of things, but I think you're actually pretty well known. I don't mean to embarrass you, but you're very well known in the area of mediation and negotiation, alternative dispute resolution. This is really what you've come to really be an expert in throughout your years, whether it's in school or outside of school. You've done so much. So recently you've worked with the Air Force Academy, helping the Air Force Academy build a negotiation program. So we'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts about working on that and working with, working in this mediation negotiation field, and maybe even tell us like how you first got started getting involved with this field, like your first classes in it and anything like that you want to share with us.
Well, the experience at the Air Force Academy was fairly recent. That was 3 years ago. And that was an amazing experience. It was like a kid at a toy store. People would ask, where are you traveling this year? Because I have traveled a lot during my career. And I'd say, well, I'm going to a new country, but it happens to be located in the US. It's called the military. And because I had no military background, and it was like going to a different country, very different culture. People were terrific there. They had great interest in building a negotiation program. This is in Colorado Springs, the U.S. Air Force Academy. To the Air Force, like West Point is the Army. This is the institution that generates officers for the Air Force and pilots. So, and they want to build a negotiation program. So I said, I'm on board. Let's do it. I'm always up for something I haven't done before. That sounds interesting, and this sounded meaningful, and that I've learned a lot from it, which I did. But the question you asked was, how do you even get involved in this? And when did it all start? Well, when I was in law school, there were not courses in negotiation. The field did not even exist at that point. So it wasn't law school I was being informed by this. What happened is that after I practiced law for about 8 years, I went back to graduate school. I went back to a place called the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard to get a master's in public administration. And there I saw listed a course on negotiation. So I thought, oh, okay, I have an interest. That sounds useful. Let me go take the course. And the course was still in formation. It was a hodgepodge of material at this point because it's still very early in the field. And one of the speakers was a guy by the name of Roger Fisher. Roger Fisher wrote a book called Getting to Yes, which is probably today the most widely used book in the field of negotiation or mediation in the world. It's translated in dozens of languages. And one of the speakers was the guy by the name of Roger Fisher, who comes to class and says, I want to tell you about my brand new book. And I actually have a first edition of his book, a hard copy of his book. Very few people have that. And I hear him talk about his book and what he was discussing. And then we were doing exercises, a lot of negotiation exercises. Again, these are early stage exercises. People are still figuring this out. And one of the exercises we did, was fun and really stuck with me for a long time, the lessons to this day, was this is 1981, 82. It was right after the Iranian hostages have been released, right afterwards. And for those who may not recall that, this is going back to 1980 when the Iranian revolution takes place. They take hostage somewhere around 50 plus Americans who are then held for what turns out to be over a year. And for those who might recall those days, every day in TV, you'd see hostages day 5, hostages day 20, hostages day 40. There was a counter going on. The whole country was focused on this unimaginable event that there were Americans being held hostage in a foreign country and Americans could do nothing about it. One of the two reasons why Carter did not get reelected. So now they do get released. And they get released on the day that Reagan gets sworn in, on January 20th. And now I'm taking this class. And the class becomes, what would you have done if you were advising Carter? What could he have done differently? And this is a course at Harvard. So people are somewhat self-confident. And there's a large class, probably 100 plus students there. And most everyone has opinions, what Carter should have done, a lot of second guessing going on, and expressed with a great degree of confidence. And I'm just sitting there listening. I had no idea. I didn't have the background. I didn't know what to do. I'm just listening and learning. At which point, after this full discussion, the professor says, by the way, in the class, one of your students is one of the 2 female hostages that were there during that year. The whole place went silent. And then he turned to her and said, what's your view of what went on? And she told a completely different story than everyone else was speculating. And she was there firsthand. She talked about conversation she had with people holding her hostage and what they were fearful of and what their interests were, which is a big idea in the area of negotiation. And I walked away from that with a thought that has stuck with me ever since. And that is, you really need to have a lot of humility about what you don't know. And in any negotiation or any conflict, you really should first spend your time understanding what's happening. Ask lots of questions. When I teach the course of negotiation, the first month of the class is on this concept before you start negotiating. And students get a little frustrated at the beginning because they think they're going to be negotiating right away. I said, no. We're not being negotiating right away. We're going to learn how to prepare for negotiation. And you'll get used to this idea that you need to ask lots of questions, or the term that I like using, you need to listen to learn. And that was a big lesson for me. There was a lesson that was reinforced in another class I took, which was sort of a fun class because of things going on today. And I took a course from on government regulation from Judge Breyer, who is now retired from the Supreme Court. And who incidentally was one of my references for law teaching. And Judge Breyer, it was a small seminar, 12, 15 people, talking about government regulation marketplace. And he had just published a book on regulation and its reform. And the lesson I walked away from that course was based on something he kept saying repeatedly. He said there are more solutions out there than problems. And his message was the same message I got out of the negotiation course. People are too busy coming up with answers without understanding what the problem is. And so you need to focus on understanding what's happening before you start coming up with solutions. So those are some of my early lessons in negotiation. And I still teach that lesson today.
That's great. That is such a good lesson. And it's probably easier said than done. So it's good that you
Yeah.
force the students to spend some time.
It is easier
really
said than done.
thinking about it.
Students start negotiating too quick. Everyone does. Culturally, we do that. Culturally, our instinct is get in there and start negotiating. And the way I teach it is slow down, spend all the stuff outside what I call the circle of negotiation before you go inside the circle. There's a lot of work to be done. So.
Great point. It's a great point because you'll be that much more effective when you're in the circle if you've done
Yeah.
your work outside the circle. So
right.
That's great. That's great. How interesting that the student in your class had been a hostage. That is
wow.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. You never know who's going to be in the room.
You're right. You never know. I remember that time pretty well too. It was a crazy, crazy time. You described it very accurately with the news and what it was on every day. And that was what everyone was talking about. But thank you for that. That is so interesting. I guess I want to move to your most recent publication, because I think you're working on an article now that's basically ready to be, it's practically ready to be published,
it's at
right?
the publisher now, and all my edits are in now.
Great. So then
I'm waiting for those students to do their job and publish the darn thing already.
Right. And they're working very hard. I know they are. So tell us about that article. Tell us a little bit about what it was about.
Well, this article is also a story about flexibility and always and being alert, because opportunities are there. What happens is people miss them. So I'm now at the Air Force Academy, and the head of the head of my department that hired me was the law department. She was a colonel at the time, and she was the person in charge of the department that I was working with. And I said, she was the one that wanted to build this negotiation program. It was her vision. So I said to her, could we have lunch or breakfast together once a month during my year there, so I can go over with you what I'm doing, and for you to let me know whether I'm on track, because I don't want you to be disappointed at the end of the year that I didn't accomplish what you wanted me to accomplish. And she said, okay, let's do that. So we get together for these monthly lunches and breakfasts, and they turn into wide range conversations. And I started learning that one of her projects before she came to the Air Force Academy to head this department is she worked in the Pentagon on the group that worked on the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And the more she told me about that story, the more I realized it was a multi-party negotiation. And she never saw it that way. She said, we're just doing what Secretary of Defense told us to do. And it was a huge operation. We're talking about 70, 80 people. She was working directly for the co-chair of this working group. They worked for 9 months. They had about $10 million budget. It was a huge operation, but she never thought about the negotiation process. So we started talking about that negotiation process, and we decided, let's do a program on this. So we do a program for the American Bar Association annual meeting on dispute resolution. And they selected that program to be a plenary program. We proposed as a workshop. They wanted to be a primary program for the whole conference. So we do this program for them. 800-900 people come to it. It was very nicely received. And then afterwards, I said, why don't we do an article on this? She goes, fine, let's do that. But she's a little busy now because she gets promoted. She becomes head of the Air Force Academy.
Wow.
She goes from becoming a colonel to a general, a one-star general, and becomes the dean of the Air Force Academy. So she's now in charge of all 4,000 cadets, the hundreds of faculty, everything, not this one little department. But she still wanted to do the project. And I couldn't do the project without her because she had information I could never get access to because she knew what really happened. So we did this paper, this article. And it turned out to be a bigger article than either of us anticipated. We just got the printed version of it. It's 98 pages in the printed version. And it has a great title. You always have this issue about titles when writing articles. The title tends to be the last thing you do. And I remember I had during the summer, we finished up the article, it was 2 years ago. And then I could work on it for a whole semester because of the COVID and all the craziness going on at the school. We were doing this hybrid teaching, which was so challenging. It was my most challenging semester I ever had teaching. And now that's over. And I take a fresh look at the article. I go, what are we saying? what's the significance of this article? Is it just a story, or does it have any future value? And the title of the article is Negotiating Social Change, always a colon for the academics in the world. The backstory on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And the article is about how this is about negotiating a cultural shift in the military to open the doors for full service and participation by gay and lesbian military service people. And that's what the article is about.
Great.
And so hopefully some people will read it.
People will read it.
about
And that's so insightful because she has all of the information, right? So anyone who reads this is getting access to the real story, the real.
Well, more so than you might imagine, because wait till you hear this piece of it. A lot of real people have always been a little challenged by me because I don't like doing the same thing over and over again. I get bored. When I interviewed for law teaching the first time, I remember one school, not this school, and when interviewing me, he said, "What's your biggest fear with teaching?" I said, "I don't know how I'm going to do. I have to do the same thing over and over again." Because there's some people who are great at that, and I really respect that. And the quality, like these people do these Broadway plays, and they do the shows 9 times or 8 times a week. I go, wow, I couldn't do that and still feel fresh. I've taught 15 courses at the school. Most faculty, I suspect, have taught 5 or less. But that's part of, so I get to this project here. And I go, what can I do that's a little different here? And it's what you just said. She has inside information. We brought different perspectives to this project. She's been uniformed for roughly the same number of years that I've been teaching. Now she's much younger than I am. Military is not for older folks. So I learned. When I was there, I was by far the oldest person there. The people I was working with were the ages of my kids. So, but she has been in the military for a long time, and I've been teaching for a long time. So what we did in the article, and no one objected to it this time, this is a new idea. We actually, at the end of each segment, we have separate commentary, where she shares her personal views of what was happening behind the scenes that only she would know. And then I would share my perspective as a dispute resolution person about some of the things she was talking about. So in the article, it has all this private separate commentary. So most articles says we, except when we get to these separate commentaries. So hopefully that enriches the subject for people to hear her voice. And some of her stories are quite funny and colorful. They're stories you would never know about, but it gives you a feel of what was going on behind the scenes.
So interesting. So that is different, and that's great. And I think you did just give people a reason to pick up that article and take a look at it. So that's fantastic.
Let's hear what General Latendra has to say, and to test to see if they could ever actually read it is whether they get to the point where she talks about her children in the basement of the Pentagon.
Wow.
When they're finalizing the report and what happened there. So the funny little story.
Definitely intriguing. Okay, that's wonderful. Well, I thank you so much. I have one last question for you that I think would be great if you don't mind answering, because this is fantastic. And this is just more like insightful. Maybe you can give some guidance to anyone here who is, listening. Based on your career so far, do you have any final thoughts on what lawyers can do to try to make a difference?
Well, I'm glad to hear the question was framed as my career so far. I like that. Yeah, I have some views on this because of, one of the things to prepare for this interview, I had to go back and think about my own life. And I'd had to develop a chronology, as I shared with you, so you had some sense of what I've done. But for me, it was the first time I ever compiled all that. I had all that stuff in a resume, but not as a chronology. Not as a sequence of events to think about how they might have affected me and impacted me as I move forward in my career. And so the big lesson for me, because one of the things I have tried to do during my career in my own small way, I'm not president of the United States, I'm just a single individual, just an academic, is try to make some difference, something that improves the world in some small and modest way, which is all I can do. It's all we all can do. And everyone did something, maybe it will be a little better place to live. So my advice, my summary of all this is that I've concluded there are two kinds of people out there. And you can figure out who's who in the world based on this label. And that is the transactional people and the people who have vision, who see the bigger picture. Transactional people are people who are just getting through the day, they're instrumental, they're just doing what they have to do without much thought about how it fits into the big picture, how it might lead to reform or some changes that might make this a little better place. They're just getting through the day and all they care about is that. And some people call that simply transactional. And there've been articles and books written on this idea of transactional leadership to be compared to more inspirational or more visionary. Now, visionary is a big word, so I don't like using that in this context, but at least have some vision of where you're going, how things fit in. And I'm going to share with you a story that is an old story. It's not my story. It's been well reported, but it says a lot. It's a story about JFK, President Kennedy. He's now President of the United States, 1962, and he's going to NASA for the first time to see where the rockets are built. He's walking down the hallway, and he sees a man there sweeping the floors. In those days, they called them janitors. So the story goes, he encounters this janitor. He starts talking with him about his work there. And he introduces himself. He says, "Hi, I'm John Kennedy. I'm President of the United States. Nice to meet you." And he gives him his name. And he says, "So what do you do here?" And he sees him sweeping. He goes, "This is the best job in the world." He says, "I am here helping to put the first man on the moon." That is a great story because it's understanding the big picture. It's understanding he wasn't just transactional, cleaning the floors. He was part of a larger mission, a larger goal. And I think about that lesson to give just two quick examples in terms of my own career. When I first started in poverty law as a legal service attorney, I remember noticing a lot of my clients were coming with default judgments. And I go, "What's going on here? I'm spending all this time making motions to open up default judgments. Why are they doing this?" And the reason is because the summons form, which is a form, was so confusing. They didn't know what to do. They get the summons and they figured, that's it, it's over. And they go to, it said, "I summon you to appear to the the plaintiff's office." So he goes to the plaintiff's attorney's office. And what does the plaintiff attorney says? "Oh, I'm glad you're here. You sign this piece of paper, everything will go away." And he was signing a default judgment. And now they come to me and they have all these default judgments. So I figured, okay, look at the bigger picture. What can we do to change this systemically? It's a systemic issue. So I started doing research on the summons, the source, started contacting the local newspaper, do some newspaper articles on it, got an editorial from the local paper, drafted a proposal to change the law on this, went to the people who had responsibility, made the presentation to try to get them to change the summons. I failed, did not change a thing. But two lessons. One is seeing the big picture. The other is why it failed. I still remember being at that meeting. It was of the Fourth Judicial Department. And they said, a couple of the people on the committee said, "I don't get what the problem is. My clients don't have these problems." There lies the problem. They didn't understand the needs of this disadvantaged group. They understand what it's like to be living in poverty, what it's like to be living in, to be less educated than they are. They couldn't understand and relate to the problem. So, but I think it's important to always keep an eye on the bigger issue. And so I'll give one other example. I could give more, but I'm sick we're out of time. But the one other example, because it's a recent example, is I just finished working for 3 years on a project before the United Nations, drafting a treaty called the Singapore Mediation Treaty. And I worked on that for the whole 3 years of the project. There was a lot of work on drafting it. The treaty is on enforcing mediated settlement agreements across border. So if you get mediation between a party in France and a party in the US, and you want to enforce the agreement the mediation in the U.S., you typically would have to just enforce under U.S. law, but here's a treaty that simplifies that procedure, makes it easier to enforce that settlement agreement. The treaty got adopted. And people say to me, why did you spend the time on something that's not a very big problem? There's not a big problem in mediation. Most mediated agreements get complied with. Why? Because people formulated them. They're invested in them. Very rarely are they breached. They said, why'd you do it? And I said, because it wasn't about the treaty. It was about making mediation put mediation in even playing field with the field of arbitration. Arbitration has something called the New York Convention. When people are choosing between mediation and arbitration, one of the reasons they choose arbitration is because they have an enforcement mechanism. And so they feel more confident using that process. By mediation having a comparable treaty will mean that parties, when deciding whether to arbitrate or mediate, will make a decision on the merits of that process, not based on what I like calling an infrastructure that supports that process. And so it was never about the treaty in my mind. It was about creating an infrastructure for mediation. And that's what I think is important for all the work we do if you want to make a difference, is to try to see your work not as the Kennedy story goes, about sweeping the floor, but about how does it fit into the bigger picture. And I think, and for me, that's what made my career meaningful for me. And my advice to anyone else is give that a try. Try to live more than a transactional life as a professional. Try to have a purpose. Try to make a difference. I can't speak for other people, but for me, it's been a lot of fun, very meaningful, and has given me a lot of professional satisfaction.
Well, we can see, and it's clear from your stories, it's clear from the way you tell your stories that you have a lot of satisfaction from what you've done. And it's clear that you have been helpful in your roles. And I think you're right. As long as you do in some way help, it's a step in that right direction, and others will join in and others will continue those steps. And it's wonderful to be part of that. So thank you really for all of your hard work and doing what you do for the better of society. I think the public.
I'm not alone in that. I don't want to put myself on a pedestal like that.
Right,
I appreciate that. Everybody can do something. We all can.
No, that's right.
Really just, I appreciate the compliments and the comments, but I don't want people to walk away thinking, okay, that's Abramson poster child. Everybody can do something.
Right. And I think that message actually has been made very clear just throughout this conversation, because I do think it's inspiring for people to hear things that have been done, that little things can turn into bigger things, and any kind of help, you're working, if you're visionary, if you're thinking of what is out there, what's in the big picture, you can make a difference, even if it doesn't seem that your part was the direct part. It's a link to some other person's part, and eventually everyone working together will make the difference. And I think that's all we can do. That's the best we can do. So,
well, and maybe one thing I'll just add to that point, because I'm thinking about what you've been focusing on, and that is about law students or recent graduates that might listen to this, is when we admire our day-to-day stuff, and it's helpful to think about the big picture. That's what I would advocate, is because when I was working on that treaty, it wasn't fun every day. There were some hard drafting issues to deal with. Other projects I worked on with that summons complaint that I gave, the summons, the day-to-day work isn't all exciting. It's hard work. It can be interesting, but it makes a difference when you see it as part of a larger picture. So.
Absolutely. That's great advice. I want to thank you so much for spending your time here on this podcast discussing parts of your career. Of course, we couldn't get the entire thing in, but it was a really nice snap. It was a highlight reel of your career.
Highlight reel. Well,
I think it was great. So thank you for sharing it. Thank you for being here. And yeah, we wish everyone, hope everyone who's watching does feel a little bit inspired by some of what we discussed here today. So,
Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's
You're
always a
welcome.
joy to spend some time with you. And I look forward to our next opportunity.